The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as David stood in line at the Henderson Community Center. It was a Tuesday afternoon and the line stretched all the way to the main entrance. 15 people ahead of him, maybe more. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, clutching the printed registration form he'd filled out at home. 34 years old. And here he was, starting over. Again, 3 months ago, the warehouse where he'd worked for 6 years had closed down. No warning. Just a meeting one morning where they announced the building was being sold. 2 weeks severance pay and a handshake. That was it. David had bills to pay, a 12-year-old daughter who needed school supplies, and a resume that looked pretty thin when he spread it out on his kitchen table. But he wasn't going to give up. He'd heard about this free coding workshop from a guy at the unemployment office. 6 months of training, real skills, actual certificates at the end. It wasn't much, but it was something. A direction. A chance. The woman in front of him kept checking her phone and sighing. She was probably in her late 30s, wearing clothes that looked expensive even to David's untrained eye. Her purse alone probably cost more than his rent. She had that look about her, the kind that said she was used to things moving at her pace. David didn't mind waiting. He'd gotten good at patience over the past 2 years. After the divorce, after the custody battle, after the nights he'd spent sitting in his car outside his ex-wife's house, just to catch a glimpse of his daughter through the window. He'd learned that some things you just couldn't rush. Some things required you to stand still and breathe through it. The line moved forward. One person registered, then another. David pulled out his phone to check the time. 4:30. The website had said registration stayed open until 6, so he had plenty of time. Still, there was that little voice in the back of his head, the one that always expected things to go wrong. What if they ran out of spots? What if they closed early? What if this was just another dead end? He pushed the thoughts away. That was the old David talking, the one who'd let fear run his life. The new David, the one who'd spent 18 months in therapy working through his anger and self-doubt, knew better. Things would work out or they wouldn't, but worrying about it wouldn't change anything. The woman in front of him made another exasperated sound and turned around. David looked up, meeting her eyes. She glanced at him briefly, then looked past him at the line behind. "Excuse me," David said politely. "Do you know if registration stays open past 5? I just want to make sure I don't miss the window." The woman's eyes snapped back to him. She looked him up and down, and David saw something change in her expression. It was a look he'd seen before, a kind of instant judgment that happened in less than a second. His worn jeans, his old jacket with the frayed cuffs, his work boots that had seen better days. She was adding it all up, putting him in a box, deciding who he was without knowing a single thing about him. "Why don't you just come back tomorrow?" she said, her voice sharp and dismissive. "When you're not holding up people who actually have somewhere to be." The words landed like a slap. David felt his chest tighten, that old familiar feeling of being small, of being less than. For a moment he was back in high school, being mocked for his thrift store clothes. He was back at family dinners where his ex-wife's parents made little comments about his job, his prospects, his worth. But then something else kicked in. Something he'd built carefully over the past 2 years, brick by brick, session by session with his therapist. A foundation that couldn't be shaken by someone else's opinion. He knew who he was. He knew his value. He knew that this woman's judgment said everything about her and nothing about him. David smiled. It was a genuine smile, not sarcastic or bitter, just calm. "I'll make sure to be quick when it's my turn," he said simply. The woman blinked, clearly surprised by his response. She seemed to expect anger or defensiveness, maybe an argument. When she didn't get it, she turned back around quickly, her neck flushing red. David took a breath and let it out slowly. His heart was beating faster, but his hands were steady. That was growth right there. A year ago, he would have spent the next hour replaying that moment in his head, coming up with better responses, feeling that hot shame burning in his gut. He would have let it ruin his day, maybe his whole week. Now he could see it for what it was. A hurt person hurting someone else. Probably she was having a bad day. Probably she had her own problems, her own fears. It didn't excuse what she'd said, but it also didn't need to become his problem. His daughter had asked him once, after a particularly rough visit where her mother had said some cutting things, "Dad, how do you stay so calm when Mom is mean to you?" He'd thought about it for a long time before answering. "Because I know who I am, sweetheart. And when you really know who you are, When you've done the hard work to understand your own value, other people's words just become noise. They can't get in unless you open the door. She'd nodded like she understood, but he knew she was too young to really get it. He hoped she'd learn it easier than he had, without the years of pain and self-doubt that had driven him to finally seek help. The line moved forward again. David was only 5 people back now. He glanced at the woman in front of him and noticed her name tag for the first time. Workshop coordinator. So she worked here. She was part of the program he was trying to join. For a second, doubt crept in. Would she remember this? Would it affect his chances? Would she find a way to keep him out of the program? Then he pushed that thought away too. If that happened, he'd deal with it. If this program didn't work out, he'd find another one. He'd learned that there was always another way forward, even when it didn't feel like it. The woman didn't turn around again. She kept her eyes fixed forward, her shoulders tense. When her turn came at the registration desk, she moved through quickly, speaking in low tones to the person behind the counter. Then she disappeared through a side door without looking back. David stepped forward when his turn came. The young man at the desk smiled warmly. Here for the coding workshop? Yes, sir, David said, handing over his form. Great. Let me get you all set up. As the man typed his information into the computer, David felt something settle in his chest. Relief, maybe. Or just the quiet satisfaction of knowing he'd handled that moment the right way. Not the perfect way. Not the way that felt good in the moment, but the way that honored who he was trying to become. He didn't know it then, but that 30-second interaction in line was going to change his life. Not because of what she'd said, but because of how he'd responded. Because staying calm when someone insults you isn't about them at all. It's about knowing who you are. And that knowing, that certainty, is the kind of strength that can't be shaken. 3 weeks into the workshop, David was usually the first one to arrive and the last one to leave. He'd found something he didn't expect to find. He was actually good at this. The logic of coding, the way problems broke down into smaller pieces, the satisfaction of making something work. It all made sense to him in a way that felt natural. His instructor, Mr. Chen, had pulled him aside after class one day. You've got an eye for this, he'd said. Most people struggle with the debugging process, but you seem to enjoy it. David had smiled at that. I guess I'm used to fixing things that are broken. The advanced sessions happened on Thursday evenings. That's when she showed up, the woman from the registration line. Her name was Victoria, and she taught the more complicated stuff. Design patterns, database management, the things that separated hobbyists from actual developers. The first time David saw her walk into the classroom, his stomach dropped. She swept in with a laptop under her arm and a coffee in her hand, looking polished and professional. She didn't make eye contact with anyone at first, just started setting up her presentation at the front of the room. David kept his head down. Maybe she wouldn't remember him. Maybe it didn't matter anyway. But 20 minutes into the lecture, when she was explaining something about SQL queries, her eyes landed on him. There was a flicker of recognition, then she quickly looked away. Her rhythm stumbled for just a second before she continued talking. After that, it became a pattern. She'd teach, answer questions, help other students. But with David, there was always this invisible wall. When he raised his hand, she'd call on someone else. When he stayed after class to work on projects, she'd leave quickly, barely acknowledging the few students who remained. It bothered him at first. Not because he needed her approval, but because he was genuinely excited about what he was learning. He had questions. He wanted to understand the deeper concepts, and she was clearly knowledgeable, the kind of teacher who could explain complex things in ways that made sense. But David had learned something important over the past 2 years. You can't control what other people think of you. You can only control how you show up. So he kept showing up. Every Thursday, every advanced session. He took notes. He asked questions when she'd answer them. He helped other students who were struggling. There was an older woman in the class, Helen, who kept getting confused by the syntax. David started staying late with her, walking through the problems step by step. There was a young kid, maybe 19, who was brilliant but too shy to speak up. David made sure to partner with him on group projects, helping him build confidence. Mr. Chen noticed. You're turning into a leader in this program, he told David one afternoon. That's a skill that's just as valuable as the coding. The real turning point came during the group project presentations. Each team had to build something useful, something that solved a real problem. David's team had spent weeks working on their idea. An app for elderly people who struggled with public transportation. Simple large buttons, clear directions, audio instructions, maps that actually made sense. David's teammate, Raphael, was supposed to do the presentation. He was the smooth talker, the one who was good with words. But the morning of the presentation, Raphael texted the group. His kid was sick. He couldn't make it. Everyone looked at David. "You know the code better than anyone," said Jennifer, another teammate. "You should do it." David's hands were sweating when he stood up in front of the class. Public speaking had never been his thing, but he thought about his daughter, about the promise he'd made to himself to stop hiding. To stop playing small, he started talking. At first his voice was shaky, but then something happened. He stopped thinking about the people watching and started thinking about the app, about his own grandmother who'd passed away 2 years ago, and how scared she'd been to take the bus alone. About all the older people who felt trapped in their homes because getting around the city felt impossible. His voice grew steadier. He pulled up the app on the projector and walked through each feature. The way the GPS spoke directions in a calm, clear voice. The way the app sent text updates to family members so they'd know their loved one was safe. The panic button that could call for help if something went wrong. The room was quiet. David looked up from his demo and realized everyone was leaning forward. Even Victoria. Especially Victoria. When he finished, there was actual applause. Not the polite kind, but real appreciation. Mr. Chen was nodding enthusiastically. "That's exactly what I'm talking about," he said. "Technology that serves people, that solves real problems." After class, David was packing up his laptop when Mr. Chen approached him. He had that look on his face, the one that meant he wanted to say something serious. "I need to tell you something," Mr. Chen said quietly. "Victoria came to me after the first week. She told me she'd made a terrible assumption about you at registration. She was too embarrassed to apologize directly." David stopped what he was doing. "Oh, she said you were one of the most talented students we've had in years. She's been watching your progress even though she hasn't said anything to you directly." David didn't know what to feel. Part of him wanted to feel vindicated. "See, I told you. You were wrong about me." But mostly he just felt sad. Sad for her, really. Because he recognized something in Victoria's behavior. The need to be right. The fear of being vulnerable. The wall she kept between herself and everyone else. He'd been that person once. Before therapy. Before the work of actually dealing with his pain instead of projecting it onto others. "Thanks for telling me," David said finally. Mr. Chen looked at him curiously. "You're not angry?" David thought about it. "No, I mean what she said hurt. But I think she's carrying around her own stuff, you know? Her own pain. It's not really about me," Mr. Chen smiled. "That's very mature of you," David shrugged. "I've had good therapists." Walking to his car that night, David thought about Victoria, about how she'd looked during his presentation, her expression shifting from dismissive to genuinely interested. He wondered what her story was. What had happened to make her so defensive, so quick to judge? He'd learned that hurt people hurt people. It was one of those simple truths that explained so much of human behavior. Victoria had been hurt by something, and she was protecting herself the only way she knew how. By keeping people at a distance. By making judgments before anyone could judge her. David understood that. He'd done the same thing for years. His phone buzzed. A text from his daughter. "Dad, I told my teacher about your app today." She said, "It sounds amazing. I'm proud of you." David sat in his car for a moment, reading the message again. This was why he'd stayed calm that day in line. Why he'd kept showing up even when Victoria made it clear she didn't want him there. Because his daughter was watching, learning from him, seeing that you could face disrespect with dignity, that you could be underestimated and still believe in yourself. He texted back, "Thanks, sweetheart. That means everything to me." As he drove home, David realized something. Victoria's opinion of him had changed, not because he'd demanded an apology or proved himself or fought for recognition. It had changed because he'd simply continued being who he was, consistent, helpful, present. There was power in that. Real power. The kind that didn't need to announce itself or defend itself. The kind that just existed, steady and unshakable. He didn't know what would happen next with Victoria. Maybe she'd apologize. Maybe she wouldn't. Either way, David would be okay, because he knew who he was, And that knowing was becoming the most valuable thing he owned. The email came on a Monday morning. David was drinking his second cup of coffee when his phone buzzed. It was from Mr. Chen, marked urgent. Emergency meeting today at 4 p.m. All students required to attend. David's stomach knotted. Nothing good ever came from emergency meetings. That afternoon, the classroom was packed. 50 students crammed into a space meant for 30. Everyone was talking, speculating. David found a seat near the back and waited. Victoria walked in first, followed by Mr. Chen and two people David didn't recognize. Victoria looked different, tired. Her usual polished appearance was still there, but something was off. Her shoulders were tight, her jaw clenched. She wasn't making eye contact with anyone. Mr. Chen cleared his throat. The room went quiet. Thank you all for coming on short notice. I'm not going to sugarcoat this. We've lost our primary funding. The company that was sponsoring this program has pulled out. Effective immediately, the room erupted. Voices talking over each other. Someone swore. A woman in the front row started crying. David sat frozen. This couldn't be happening, not now. Not when things were finally starting to come together. We're going to finish out this week, Mr. Chen continued, raising his voice over the noise. But after Friday, we'll have to suspend the program. We're doing everything we can to find alternative funding, but I wanted to be honest with you about where things stand. Victoria stepped forward, for the first time since David had known her. She looked genuinely vulnerable. Her hands were shaking slightly as she gripped the edge of the desk. This program was supposed to run for 6 months, she said, her voice barely steady. We're not even halfway through. I've sent dozens of emails to potential donors, corporate partners, everyone I can think of. But no one's responding fast enough. I don't know what else to do. The defeat in her voice was painful to hear. David found himself leaning forward, listening not as a student but as someone who recognized that particular brand of hopelessness. The meeting ended badly. People were angry, throwing out blame. Someone said the center should have had backup funding. Someone else said this was typical, that programs for poor people always got cut first. Victoria just stood there, taking it all, her face pale. David didn't say anything. He just watched. That evening, instead of going home, David sat in the computer lab. The building was quiet. Most students had left, too frustrated or disappointed to stick around. But David couldn't leave. His mind was racing. This program wasn't just about him. There was Helen, the older woman who was finally learning skills that could get her out of retail work. There was the shy 19-year-old who'd told David this was his only shot at college because his family couldn't afford tuition. There were 45 other people whose lives would be derailed if this program shut down. David opened his laptop and started searching. Crowdfunding platforms, local business associations, grant databases, tech companies with community investment programs. He made a list. Then he started making a bigger list. Contact names, email addresses, phone numbers. By 9 p.m., he had a spreadsheet with over 60 potential leads. By 11, he'd drafted 3 different pitch emails, each one tailored to different types of donors. He included statistics about the program's success rate, testimonials from students, a breakdown of exactly how much money was needed and what it would accomplish. He also did something else. He looked up Victoria's LinkedIn profile, her background, where she'd worked before, and suddenly things started making sense. Because this isn't about you and me, he said. It's about the 47 other people in this program who need it. People like Helen, who's trying to build a better life. People like the kid who sits in the back who's too scared to speak up but is brilliant with code. He paused, choosing his words carefully. And because I know what it's like to be struggling and have someone write you off before you get a chance to show what you can do. I know how that feels. I wouldn't wish it on anyone else. Victoria's eyes filled with tears. She blinked rapidly, trying to hold them back. I'm so sorry, she whispered. That first day at registration, I was coming from a meeting where my boss told me my position might be cut, that this whole program might not survive past the pilot phase. I was terrified and angry, and I took it out on you. I made assumptions based on nothing but my own fear. She wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand. I grew up in a world where you couldn't show weakness, where everything was about image and success. My marriage just ended because my ex-husband said I was too cold, too focused on my career. And maybe he was right. Maybe I've been so busy protecting myself that I forgot how to actually connect with people. David pulled out the chair across from her desk and sat down. I used to be like that too, he said. Different reasons, but same result. I was so scared of being hurt that I hurt everyone first. It took me losing my family to realize I needed help. Victoria looked at him with something like wonder. But you're so calm, so sure of yourself, David shook his head. That's not confidence. That's just knowing who I am. I spent 2 years in therapy figuring out my worth, learning that other people's opinions don't define me. It's not about being perfect. It's about doing the work. They sat in silence for a moment. Then Victoria took a deep breath. Okay, she said, straightening up in her chair. Show me that spreadsheet again. If you're willing to help save this program, then let's save it. David smiled and turned his laptop around. First thing we need to do is organize a showcase. Let the students demonstrate their projects to local business owners. Show them what we're actually accomplishing here. Victoria nodded, already making notes. I have contacts at 3 tech companies. I've been afraid to reach out because of my pride, but this is bigger than my ego. Exactly, David said. As they worked through the morning, something shifted between them. The wall came down. They were just 2 people trying to solve a problem together, and David realized that this right here was why he'd stayed calm that day in line. Because anger would have closed this door forever, Grace had left it open. Over the next 3 weeks, David and Victoria became an unlikely team. They met every morning at 7, before the center officially opened. Victoria would bring coffee. David would bring updates on his outreach efforts. They'd sit in her cluttered office and strategize like generals planning a campaign. The first donation came from a local restaurant owner whose mother had used David's transportation app during the showcase. $500. It wasn't much, but it was something. Victoria actually cried when she saw the check. It's real, she said, wiping her eyes. People actually care about this. David smiled. Of course they do. You just have to show them why it matters. That became their approach. They stopped asking for money and started telling stories. Helen's story about escaping an abusive relationship and needing new skills to support herself. The story of a father of 3 who'd been laid off after 20 years and was retraining for a new career. Real people. Real stakes. The responses started coming in. A tech entrepreneur offered to fund 2 months of the program if they could get matching donations. A local bank agreed to sponsor 5 student scholarships. A retired software engineer volunteered to teach additional weekend sessions for free. David watched Victoria transform during those weeks. The rigid, defensive woman from registration day was disappearing. In her place was someone more open, more willing to admit when she didn't have all the answers. She laughed more. She asked students about their lives instead of just their code. One afternoon, they were reviewing budget spreadsheets in her office when Victoria suddenly stopped typing. Can I tell you something? She asked. David looked up from his laptop. Sure, she took a breath. I've been thinking a lot about that day at registration, about why I was so cruel to you. And I realized it wasn't just about having a bad day. She stared at her hands. I grew up in a family where success was everything. My father built his company from nothing, and he never let us forget it. Everything was about performance, about being the best, about never showing weakness. David listened quietly. When I got married, I thought I'd escaped that, but I just recreated it. My ex-husband and I competed with each other constantly. Who made more money? Who had the better job? Who was more respected? It was exhausting. She looked up, meeting David's eyes. When he asked for a divorce, he said I was impossible to live with, that I made everything into a competition, that I looked down on people I considered beneath me, and he was right. That must have been hard to hear, David said. Victoria laughed, but there was no humor in it. It destroyed me, because I realized he was describing my father. I'd become the exact person I'd spent my whole life trying not to be. She rubbed her face with both hands. So when you asked me that simple question in line, and I saw your worn clothes and your nervous expression, some ugly part of me wanted to feel superior. Wanted to prove I was better than someone, anyone, because inside I felt like nothing. David nodded slowly. I get that. I really do. You know what the worst part is? Victoria continued. For weeks after, I knew I'd been wrong about you. I could see how talented you were, how kind you were to other students. But I was too proud to apologize, too scared to admit I'd been cruel for no reason. She looked at him directly now. David, I am so deeply sorry. Not just for what I said, but for every day after when I should have apologized and didn't. You deserved better than that. The office was quiet except for the hum of the ancient air conditioner. David thought about all the responses he could give. The angry ones he'd imagined in the shower sometimes. The speeches about respect and judgment. But none of those felt right anymore. "I appreciate you telling me all of this," he said finally. "And I forgive you. I forgave you a long time ago, actually." Victoria's eyes widened. "How? Why?" David leaned back in his chair. "Because I used to be someone who would carry that kind of hurt around for months. Years even. I'd replay it in my head, use it as evidence that the world was against me, that people were cruel, that I wasn't worth respect." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "But then I did therapy. Real hard therapy where I had to look at all the ways I'd been hurting myself and other people, and I learned that holding onto anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to get sick." Victoria was listening intently. "You hurt me that day," David continued. "I won't pretend you didn't, but I also saw that you were hurting too. Hurt people hurt people. It's one of those simple truths that explains so much." He smiled slightly. "And honestly, if you hadn't said what you said, I wouldn't have had the chance to prove to myself that I'd really changed. That I could handle disrespect with dignity. So in a weird way, thank you." Victoria shook her head in disbelief. "You're thanking me for insulting you?" "No," David laughed. "I'm thanking you for giving me an opportunity to be the person I've been working so hard to become. The person who knows his worth regardless of what anyone else thinks." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Then Victoria asked the question David had been expecting. "How did you get there? To that place of being so sure of yourself?" David thought about it. "It wasn't quick. After my divorce, I was a mess.
Angry all the time.
Blamed everyone else for my problems. My ex-wife, my boss, the economy. Everyone but myself." He remembered those dark months vividly. "My daughter was the one who finally made me see it. She was 10 years old and she said, 'Daddy, you're always mad now. You're not fun anymore.' That broke something open in me." "So you got help," Victoria said. "Yeah. Therapy. Support groups. I read probably 100 self-help books, though most of them were garbage." He grinned. "But slowly I started to understand that my worth wasn't determined by my job or my bank account or what anyone thought of me. It was something internal. Something I had to build myself." Victoria was taking this in, really listening. "What would you say to someone who's just starting that journey? Someone like me?" David considered the question carefully. "I'd say be patient with yourself. You're not going to undo years of programming overnight. There will be days when you fall back into old patterns. That's okay. Growth isn't linear." He leaned forward. "And I'd say find people who can see you clearly. Not the image you project, but the real you underneath. Those people are mirrors that show you the truth. Sometimes it's uncomfortable, but it's necessary. Like you've been for me these past few weeks," Victoria said quietly. David nodded. "And like you've been for me, too. Working with you has taught me that I can trust my judgment of people. That my instinct to offer grace instead of anger was the right call." Victoria stood up and walked to the window. Outside, students were arriving for the evening session, chatting and laughing. The program they'd fought so hard to save. "I've been in therapy for 6 months now," she admitted, "since the divorce. It's been helping, but working with you, seeing how you handle things, it's shown me what it actually looks like to do the work. Not just talk about it, but live it." She turned back to face him. "I want to be like that. Someone who knows who they are. Someone who doesn't need to tear others down to feel whole." "You're already becoming that person," David said. "I've watched you change over these weeks. The way you talk to students now, the way you ask for help instead of pretending you have all the answers, that's growth." Victoria smiled, and it was genuine. "We make a good team, don't we?" "Yeah," David agreed. "We really do." His phone buzzed. A text from the tech entrepreneur they'd been courting. David read it and felt his heart jump. "Victoria," he said slowly. "He's in. Full funding for the rest of the program. He wants to meet tomorrow to discuss details." Victoria's hand flew to her mouth. "Are you serious?" David turned the phone so she could see. She read the message twice, then burst into tears. Happy tears this time. David stood and, after a moment's hesitation, gave her a hug. She hugged him back, laughing through her tears. "We did it," she said. "We actually did it." "We did," David agreed. And in that moment, both of them understood something profound. The program was saved not despite that ugly moment at registration, but somehow because of it. Because David had chosen grace over anger, because Victoria had been willing to grow, because two hurt people had decided to heal instead of hurt each other more. 6 months later, David stood in the back of the Henderson Community Center auditorium, watching 50 students receive their certificates. The room was packed with families, friends, local reporters. Someone had hung a banner that read, "Congratulations, graduates," in bright blue letters. He'd done it. Actually finished something he'd started. In his hand was a certificate with his name on it and 3 job offers in his email inbox. Real jobs, good jobs, the kind that would let him provide for his daughter, maybe even save for her college. But more than that, he'd discovered something about himself. He was good at this. Not just coding, but problem solving, seeing patterns, building things that helped people. The transportation app he'd created had been downloaded over 2,000 times. Elderly people across the city were using it to maintain their independence. Victoria was at the front of the room, giving a speech. She looked different now, softer somehow, more real. She was talking about the importance of second chances, about how everyone in this room had taken a risk on themselves. "This program almost didn't make it," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the microphone. "We lost funding halfway through, and I'll be honest with you, I didn't know if we could save it." She paused, searching the crowd until her eyes found David. But one of our students refused to give up. He spent hours researching funding sources, reaching out to donors, organizing showcases. He could have walked away when things got hard. Instead, he showed up every single day and asked what he could do to help. People were looking around, trying to figure out who she was talking about. David felt his face getting hot. "David Chen, where are you?" Victoria asked. Reluctantly, David raised his hand. The room erupted in applause. He wanted to disappear into the floor. Victoria smiled at him. "David taught me something important. He taught me that real strength isn't about never showing weakness. It's about knowing who you are deep down, and not letting anyone else's opinion shake that foundation." After the ceremony, people kept coming up to David, congratulating him, asking about his app. Helen hugged him so hard he thought his ribs might crack. "Thank you for believing in me," she whispered. She'd already accepted a job at a marketing firm, doing work she actually enjoyed for the first time in her life. The shy 19-year-old, Timothy, shook his hand formally. "I got into the university program," he said, grinning. "Full scholarship. I'm going to study computer science." David felt pride swell in his chest. "You earned that. You're brilliant, Timothy. Don't ever let anyone tell you different." His daughter showed up near the end, brought by his ex-wife. Lily ran to him and threw her arms around his waist. "Dad, I'm so proud of you." David hugged her tight, breathing in the smell of her strawberry shampoo. This was why he'd done it, why he'd kept going even when things were hard, because he wanted to be someone his daughter could look up to. His ex-wife, Jennifer, approached cautiously. Things had been civil between them lately, better than they'd been in years. "Congratulations, David, really, this is impressive." "Thanks, Jen." She hesitated, then said, "You seem different, happier, more settled." David thought about that. "I am. I finally figured out who I want to be, and I'm actually becoming that person." Jennifer smiled, and for a moment he saw the woman he'd fallen in love with years ago. "I'm glad. Lily needs that." Stable David, confident David. "I'm working on it," he said. "Every day." After they left, David found Victoria standing alone by the refreshment table, staring at the empty auditorium. "Hell of a day," he said, walking up beside her. She laughed. "Yeah, hell of a day." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment. Then Victoria turned to face him. "I have something to tell you. The center wants to expand the program, run it twice a year instead of once. And they want to add a mentorship component where graduates help new students." "That's amazing," David said. "They offered me the position of program director. Permanent, better salary, actual benefits, the whole thing." David grinned. "Victoria, that's incredible. You deserve it. I told them I'd only take it on one condition." She looked at him steadily. "That you co-lead the mentorship program with me. Part-time at first, but eventually full-time if you want it. Teaching soft skills, helping students navigate the emotional side of career changes. The stuff that doesn't come from a textbook." David was speechless. "You don't have to answer now," Victoria continued quickly. "I know you have job offers. Good ones probably. But I think you'd be amazing at this. You have something that can't be taught. You know how to meet people where they are, how to see potential in them even when they can't see it themselves." David thought about the job offers sitting in his inbox. Good money. Stable companies. The kind of positions he'd dreamed about months ago. But standing here, in this room where so many people had changed their lives, he realized something. He didn't want to just write code. He wanted to help people the way he'd been helped. He wanted to be for someone else what his therapist had been for him. What Mr. Chen had been for him. What, in her own complicated way, Victoria had been for him. I don't need time to think about it, David said. I'm in. Victoria's face lit up. Really? Really? But on one condition. What's that? We do this right. Not just teaching technical skills, but teaching people how to believe in themselves. How to stay calm when the world tries to tear them down. How to know their worth. Victoria nodded seriously. Deal. They shook hands, both of them grinning like idiots. Later that night, David sat in his small apartment with his daughter asleep in the next room. He opened his laptop and started writing. Not code this time, but reflections. Lessons he'd learned. Things he wished someone had told him years ago. He wrote about that day at registration. About the insult that could have defined his entire experience but didn't. About choosing grace over anger. About the power of knowing who you are. The thing is, he typed, confidence isn't about thinking you're better than other people. It's about not needing to compare yourself to anyone at all. It's about doing the hard internal work of figuring out your values, your worth, your truth, and then living from that place regardless of what anyone else thinks. He paused, thinking about Victoria, about how far they'd both come, about how that terrible moment had somehow led to this beautiful outcome. When you know who you are, really know it, other people's opinions become just noise. They can't get in unless you open the door, and that's real power. Not the kind that dominates or controls, but the kind that stays steady when everything else is shaking. David saved the document and closed his laptop. Tomorrow he'd start planning the mentorship program. He'd reach out to the new students who were enrolling for the next session. He'd show them what he'd learned, not through lectures but through example, because that's what the world needed more of. Not people who had all the answers, but people who'd done the work. People who'd failed and gotten back up. People who'd been insulted and stayed calm. People who knew that real strength came from knowing yourself so deeply that nothing external could shake you. He thought about his daughter in the next room, about the world she was growing up in. He wanted her to learn this lesson earlier than he had. That her worth wasn't up for debate. That she could be kind without being weak. That staying calm wasn't about being passive. It was about being so secure in yourself that you didn't need to react to every provocation. David smiled in the darkness. 6 months ago, he'd been standing in a line, hearing someone judge him without knowing anything about him. He could have let that moment define him, could have carried it as proof that the world was cruel and he was less than. Instead, he'd stayed calm. And that choice, that single moment of grace, had changed everything. Not because it changed Victoria, though it eventually did. Not because it proved anything to anyone else, but because it proved something to himself. That he'd grown, that he'd healed, that he was becoming the person he'd always wanted to be. And in the end, that was the only opinion that really mattered.